What's one-threeing my biotech? This is Jeff. We're on How It's Med Today, the podcast where we chat with people like Dr. Neel Madhukar, who's our guest today, about how we're shaping the future of health tech, biotech, and how we heal people overall. Neel, after that absolutely horrid introduction, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. How are you?
Uh, quite ashamed of that. What's one-threeing my biotech? That was not good. But glad to have you on today. That was really bad. Um, you know, the first question that we always ask our guests is, how they are, but really the main thing that we'd like to get across is like who you are. So apart from being the CEO and co-founder of OneThree Biotech, which we'll get into a little bit later on, uh, how'd you get to the academic and I guess professional position that you are in now? Love to hear about that.
Yeah, I know it's a happy to kind of go through it. I wish it was a straight path, but it sadly wasn't. And to be fair,
Oh,
maybe it was a
geez.
little bit more interesting that way. Yeah, so I started off, many years ago, joining a PhD program at Cornell University's med school. So while Cornell, it was a tri-institutional PhD program between Cornell's med school, Cornell's graduate school in Ithaca, and Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. And I was very, very interested in kind of cancer drug discovery, right? How do you find new treatments for the cancer subtypes that there really aren't any treatments to after I've lost a family member to a similar type of cancer?
I'm sorry.
And at that time, Cornell was just opening up its precision medicine center, which was the US's first precision medicine center. It was, a really exciting opportunity to kind of be at the intersection of drug discovery, genetics, precision medicine, and then kind of oncology patient care. So, I jumped at that opportunity and got a chance to kind of really be involved in that. So while there, what my research really focused on throughout my entire PhD was how can you build AI systems that enable us to better understand cancer biology? And the goal is if you better understand cancer biology, you can not only better understand what drugs may or may not work, but you can also find new treatments for patients that don't have it. Fast forward kind of a couple of years, saw a lot of like early stage proof of concept coming out. I started seeing the technologies we were building actually helping patients and finding new drugs and working on diseases that really there weren't any ways to work on. And hit this really interesting moment near the end of my PhD where we were like, we want to build this, but we don't really know how. We don't really know like how I never thought about myself as starting a company. First time entrepreneur, so nothing I was super familiar with, but the more and more we started talking to pharma partners and biotechs, they're like, this could be really helpful. So I took the plunge and was like, let's learn about kind of startup world. Luckily, around that same time, Cornell Tech has this program called the Runway Incubator Program, which is essentially a way where they take PhDs and give them the training and resources needed to go from a PhD to a CEO. So I had a chance to kind of work through that system, got a little bit of startup capital, and really incubated OneThree Biotech out of that. Since then, we've been able to raise some institutional VC funding. I've grown our team to about 10 people. And now we're just kind of off to the races. So hopefully that provides a little bit of context on kind of what I'm working on.
That's a story that seems to involve a whole lot of your previous context and just knowing the right resources to have so you're able to get to where you are right now, notwithstanding your talent itself. But what drove you to pursue that research path? Because I mean, on this podcast, we've talked with so many people who are physicians, who are business people, but not that many PhDs. So why the PhD path at first?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So if you talked to me many, many years ago, I probably would have told you when I was a child that I actually wanted to be a physician. I wanted to kind of treat, um, you know, going to patient treatment. But what I learned throughout kind of undergrad and really after seeing my own family member kind of suffer through cancer treatment was that, the most interesting part to me was not necessarily the treatment aspect, but it was the understanding aspect, right? I've always
Mhm.
loved puzzles growing up. And to me, kind of like biology is like the world's greatest unsolved puzzle, right? We still barely know what's happening in a regular, human body. Now, when you add things like cancer and disease, you know even less. And I got a chance while I was an undergrad to kind of work on some of the early genetics projects and kind of see kind of firsthand how the intersection of, science and kind of mathematics, computer science were enabling us to solve problems that really we had gone unanswered, right? The genomics and genetics revolution. And I think all of those kind of coalescing made me realize that the interesting part of medicine to me wasn't necessarily patient treatment, though I think that's obviously very interesting. It was more
Mhm.
giving physicians the tools they need to do the best patient treatment, right? Finding those treatments, finding those drugs, finding those treatment opportunities so that the oncologists around the world had more drugs and more treatments in their arsenal. So that's really what excited me about it.
Mhm.
And ultimately kind of caused the shift to go into a PhD rather than kind of an MD or something similar. And then, as you said, right, like once I was in the PhD, as many dominoes kind of slowly falling together that led to, now where I'm at OneThree.
Yeah, that's okay. There's several directions that I could go, but the one direction that I'll go first is, I mean, there's this bio of you on the Cornell website that talks a little bit about how you discovered a drug in preclinical trials and how that led you down your path. Can you tell me a little bit about that story? Because that seems pretty inspirational. And discovering a drug is by no means an inexpensive or non-involved process at all. So it must have been an arduous process.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So this was a process we did with a partner, right? So one of
Yeah.
the technologies we worked on at Cornell was enabling us. So one of the things about drugs is a lot of the drugs that are working on patient treatment right now, we really just don't quite know how they work, right? Like a lot of drugs hit things in the brain body that we don't really understand. So we were working with this company on this drug called ONC201. Right? ONC201 was a drug that has shown some moderate anti-cancer efficacy, but we were still really trying to figure out how did this drug actually kill cancer? What was it going on? So using our technology in partnership with this company, what we were able to figure out was that this compound hit a target that we had never really thought about as an anti-cancer target. It hit dopamine receptor 2. So a little bit of background, right? Dopamine receptor 2 is involved in the dopamine signaling pathway, but back when we found this, no one really thought about the dopamine signaling pathway as a way to treat cancer.
Yeah.
But but the platform we were building kind of showed that this compound hit dopamine receptor 2, dopamine receptor 2 had this anti-cancer activity. And then furthermore, what our platform was able to find was that that signaling pathway was very, very relevant in a particular type of cancer, particular
Hmm.
type of glioblastoma called H3K27 methylated glioblastoma, which is a type of brain cancer with a certain methylation pattern that is highly aggressive, right?
Yeah.
So, when you have that brain cancer, life expectancies are lower, has a high pediatric occurrence, and there aren't really any great treatments out there for that type of cancer. But
Yeah.
our platform was saying that DRD2, dopamine receptor 2, and therefore this compound would work very well there. So fast forward, had the opportunity to kind of partner with that company and run a phase 2 clinical trial in that patient population. It's saw some pretty overwhelming results, right? We're seeing patients' life expectancy increase from 3 to 6 months to many have been stable disease free for over 2 years. This compound is now moving into phase 3 tests to kind of cement itself as a novel treatment option for this rare patient population. So
Mhm.
it was really interesting, right? It was the opportunity. It was kind of like we were just trying to focus on solving problems. Right? The first was how does this drug work? The second is now that we know does this drug work, what's the best way to make it work? And then what are the patients that we can use to kind of build off of? So it was a really exciting opportunity. And now like as we're seeing, for instance, excuse me, the real effect of it on patients, it's hugely rewarding.
Yeah. That's fascinating. So I am gonna talk about drug discovery later on in this conversation for sure. But what I do want to understand, or what I want perhaps you to tell the audience, is a little bit about why you think those dominoes fell. Was it the location? Was it the people that you met or the networking that you tried to do? Like what set you up, or what do you think contributed to the dominoes falling the way that they did so that you are where you are today from that starting point in involvement with that glioblastoma drug?
Yeah, no, it's a great idea. Good question. So I think the glioblastoma drug is one area, but I think in general, I think the dominoes falling the way they were, it's kind of mentorship from the people around me. Right? I had a
Mhm.
unique opportunity to work with, my professor at the time, Dr. Olivia Alimento, who's kind of a juggernaut in the field of computational drug discovery, right? He's director of precision medicine, Cornell's precision medicine program. To kind of see that emerge, right? Kind of get mentorship and kind of see firsthand how you can solve problems. I think that was invaluable. I think just the way the world was working, right, and a couple years ago, right, where you saw, biological data emerging in ways that previously hadn't been possible. You saw a similar emergence in new technology and computing activities. I think all of these kind of coalesce to make a really interesting time and space where someone like myself could get more involved in drug discovery, right? Someone who
Hmm.
doesn't come, I wasn't doing traditional experimental research, I was doing computational work. So that was really exciting. And I think similarly, there's been kind of a trend for many, many decades about pharma and generally the world understanding that drug discovery is a challenging thing.
Yeah.
So what that means is that, excuse me, what that means is that because it's a very challenging thing, there hasn't been a lot of development in, and there hasn't been a lot of development's the wrong word. There haven't been a lot of kind of dramatic improvements in success, right? Discovery rates and success rates are still relatively low. And they have been over the past decade. So
Do you have the numbers?
yeah, so I think right now, if you guess, right, the people will tell you anywhere from 1 to 3% of drugs that can go into, development activities end up making it through. So you see failure rates
That's
anywhere from
wild.
90 to 99%. People will tell you it costs anywhere from a couple hundred million to billions of dollars to develop a drug. And those
Gee.
numbers are only getting more and more expensive. So
Yeah.
I think the world was realizing we need to do something to fix this problem. There was
Yeah.
kind of a confluence of different technologies, and kind of I was lucky enough to have people who gave me the time and space to really work on these things and develop it further.
So, like, what? Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, that's pretty much it. Yeah, just really, I think that's it. I like what really let me kind of do it.
So, I mean, I think there. I mean, your talent in different fields, and the fact that you're at a confluence of the right place, right time, with different fields coming together, and the mentorship really helped. But I mean, I know that you're in the New York East Coast area where there has been a lot of investment traditionally in biotech, if I'm not incorrect. So if you were to speak to somebody younger who's interested in the same fields, who wants to bring different fields into drug development, or perhaps work in the same field of the computational design component, or trying to simplify or perhaps improve the means by which we discover drugs, do you think it's worth moving to those biotech hubs, or is just working at a university and connecting with people from a distance sufficient?
I don't think it's necessarily. I don't think you need to be in these hubs, especially nowadays. Right? If you had asked me maybe 2, 3 years ago, I would have said yes. Might be worth it, right? Because I think there's just you're in like an epicenter, right? So places like New York, Boston, San Francisco, right, where there's a confluence of different universities. So let me just take New York for example, right? New York.
Hmm.
Think about the universities, right? You have Cornell's Medical School, you have Columbia, you have NYU, Sinai, Albert Einstein, right? So many kind of great medical universities and hospitals so close to each other that you have an opportunity to interact with kind of experts in the field all over the place, right? You can, if I wanted to talk to one of the leading breast cancer oncologists, right? There's almost certainly one within a 20-minute subway from where I am.
Hmm.
And those people tend to go to similar networking events. So you have an opportunity to kind of really speak to the best people in the field. And companies of areas like New York, Boston, and SF are putting a lot of money to building out biotech ecosystems. Like New York has a few different biotech hubs here. Boston, of course, has giant biotech infrastructure. And then SF, you're seeing lot more venture capital money coming in. So I think, in that sense, right, if you're looking for like an experimental job, right, a lot of the labs are here and a lot of the companies are here. So yes. But I will say nowadays we have seen, and I have personally seen a lot more biotechs becoming remote friendly or virtual. You know,
Uh-huh.
um, for instance, we have employees all over the country right now. Not every employee is based in New York, and a lot of the New York biotechs I know are doing the same thing. Um, some roles, of course, are better suited for that. Right? If you are
Yeah.
running experimental studies, you have to be where the lab is. But if you're kind of on
Yeah.
the business side or the strategy side, might be able to be easier to be virtual. But yeah, I think like I don't think it's necessary. I think it certainly would make the networking piece easier. But if you're comfortable networking, if you meet the right people, it's by no means do you have to be around the hubs. And I don't expect that trend to only grow in the coming years. So if you ask me, I expect that if you ask me in 2 years, I will say even more strongly, you can live wherever you want. Because that's the way I've seen it over the last 2 years.
Hmm. So you dropped a little tidbit about VCs being interested in biotech, and there definitely was that trend that occurred during the pandemic. There's so much investment in healthcare overall because, I mean, it was on the front of everyone's head, and to be frank, it's still on the front of everyone's brain, albeit with different attitudes. So I guess given that given that, I'm gonna steer away from that spicy topic. Given that, I guess overall, why would VCs or other investment groups choose to put money into pharma or drug development, knowing how risky it is with that 1 to 3% success rate?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. Excuse me. I think it really just depends on how you think about it, right? It is incredibly uh, difficult, so to speak. Difficult is maybe like a way to think about it is in the sense of, there's low rates of success, but it's
Yeah.
also kind of, if you can do it correctly, there's huge opportunities for both growth and value creation, both in the patient side and the commercial side, right? A
Hmm.
successful drug can make pharma hundreds of millions to billions of dollars a year. So I think VCs have also realized that there's an opportunity there. And also I think what COVID showed us is that there's no ignoring it, right? Like
Yeah.
biotech problems and health problems are only growing, right? COVID is,
Yeah.
the infection is an example of one, but it's silly to think that in our lifetime there won't be other major things that where biotech has to step up. The question is like, they're already building these infrastructures. Like if we can make it better, there's a huge need and there's an opportunity to kind of have transformational impact on patients' lives and on kind of investors as well. So I think VCs are seeing a little bit of both. But also I think like new tools, right? Like AI is an example, but also new bioengineering tools, synthetic biology tools. Like these are the types of things that are making bio a little bit more tractable. It's not like I'm putting all of it on a highly risky bet. Is I'm trying to understand it a little bit more better. I'm trying to, make it so it's not an all or nothing understanding. I'm trying to kind of use technology to bridge that gap a little. So I think there's a little bit of, excuse me, a little bit of both you're seeing, which is, you know, um, biotech is coming from one direction and
Yeah.
uh, they're improving, and then VCs are kind of seeing that and seeing like there's an opportunity for them to get really involved here.
Mhm. And see, that's a fascinating perspective because in Canada we have a struggle with turning government innovation dollars into actual innovation companies that spin off and are able to scale and provide value to the lives of millions of patients or billions of patients worldwide. So why did you take that step off the path into the startup realm? Whereas in Canada we would have had that some attitude from some groups pushing back against, going to the dark side.
Yeah. Well, I think it's, I think it's, I understand that, right? Because I think in academia, it's
Yeah.
also this, at least used to be this idea of like, if you're moving off the academic path, you're going to the dark side. But I think it's like, it's a silly way to think of pharma and biotech and startups as the dark side, right? Like they both need each other, right? Academia and kind of academic medicine has the opportunity to answer certain questions in a certain way that biotech and industry doesn't, right? But also
Yeah.
industry and biotech have the opportunity to the resources to do questions that academics could, right? Like, you know, um, I love my time at Cornell. We found a lot of really interesting things, but we don't have the resources to take a completely novel drug target all the way through development into phase one, two, three, and trials and finally to approval. Like that
Mhm.
requires resources, requires infrastructure that just doesn't make a lot of sense for a university, but that's infrastructure that you can get within kind of a biotech ecosystem. So I think it's something like, what is the goal you're trying to solve? Like to us as always, we want to be focused on the end goal. We really want to, excuse me, think about how we can develop this in such a way that it actually can have a transformational impact on patients. And to us, biotech made the best sense to do that, or startup made the most sense to do that. And I think across the world, you're seeing more and more startup interaction. Like you're seeing, a lot of biotech startups now are becoming, for lack of a better word, more ethical or moral conscious, right? We're seeing kind of
Mhm.
public benefit corporations come out. You're seeing companies partnering with patients. You're seeing companies thinking about what they partner. And there's kind of a big thought on drug pricing. So my hope is that in the next couple of years, we see this dark side mentality wear off a little bit. But it's just, I think everyone has to understand that there are certain problems built for one industry that don't make sense for others.
Mhm. Mhm. That makes sense. I mean, that leads itself fairly well into discussion about partnerships. When we chatted offline previously, you really harped on the fact that partnerships are so important and that finding the right complementary partnerships is important. So how do you find the partnerships that fit best for you, and why are partnerships, so important in the work that you do?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, right? So I think thinking about partners, it's also once again, it's that same sort of idea of like the what can you do, right? Like as an early stage drug discovery company, what we are focused on is completely novel ways to target certain rare cancer subtypes, right? So let's say we find a new way to target lung cancer, for instance.
Yeah.
Developing a drug is a multi-step, multi-year process, right? And for instance, it's only a handful of companies around the world have the resources to do all those steps, and those companies are usually the giant pharma companies. Right. So for
Hmm.
us, we will need to partner to say, like, how do we actually develop the chemistry against it? How do we manufacture it? How do we run these clinical trials? And it makes sense to kind of work with experts, right? Just like we are good at that early stage of discovery, it makes sense to work with companies who are great at what they do and to kind of build a efficient drug discovery pipeline that way. And similarly, companies that are looking for new ways to revitalize their pipeline partner with us. So, for instance, we have a partnership with a company in the oncology space where they are looking for really to understand new disease biology in a way that they haven't, right? And that's what we
Yeah.
focalize on. So it's like this opportunity allows them to leverage our technology and expertise, and similarly us to leverage their, you know, developmental expertise and then long-term resources. So I think it's kind
Hmm.
of a synergistic marriage there. Just like, you know, you focus on one thing, I focus on the other. Together, we're going to build it.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk, or I'm going to transition this in a couple minutes into a conversation about drug discovery, because that's such a complicated and fascinating topic that, I mean, it is so interesting to learn about. But where in this story overall does the Forbes 30 under 30 fit into this?
Um, yeah, no, it's a good question, right? So the Forbes study at 30 happened when I was in grad school, right? Based on
Yeah.
kind of some of this work I was doing in glioblastoma. It was completely unexpected, right? I did not know it was happening. I found out because one of my friends sent me a congratulations message, and I was like, "Congratulations for what?"
That's a way to
So
find
that
out.
was the level of involved. Yeah, it was really interesting. It was really cool, and I think the Forbes 30 and 30 experience kind of showed me a part of the world I wasn't looking at, right? So, for instance, I had been in science, academic medicine, research all of my life. Never really been exposed to the business investor side of the world. But
Hmm.
what the Forbes acknowledgement gave me an opportunity to do is really uh, tell my science to more people. I went to conferences, I met people, and they were like, "What do you do?" And I started to talk about it a little bit more. I learned, met people from who are doing amazing things in completely other areas. Right? I met amazing tech founders. I met amazing bankers, investors, social impact, um, you know, founders, CEOs, etc. And so I had to learn a little bit more that, everything we're doing felt connected one way, right? It's like, okay, the problems
Yeah.
I'm facing actually aren't so different from the problems these people are facing, right? The more I understood about investors and banking and kind of finance, the more I understood like, oh, maybe this is something we can do together. So I could have, as it gave me the courage and the insight to kind of make that leap into I'm going from science into startups.
Okay. All right. All right. All right. So that's an easy layup. Thank you very much. Into what is OneThree Biotech?
Yeah, yeah. The stuff I think about it is we are an early stage drug discovery company,
Yeah.
right? So what we do is we develop computational technologies. We develop kind of an AI system that allows us to essentially think about simulate cancer. So we take a cancer, we take a bunch of data on cancer, patients, treatments, etc. All of that information comes together, and we've developed kind of computational algorithms that say, like, let's take all this data and understand what is causing cancer to work the way it works. And when I
Hmm.
know this information, how will cancer respond to treatment one versus treatment two versus treatment three? Let's say you're able to do all of this, right? What we can then
Hmm.
do is say, we know lung cancer is driven by this gene and this drug may hit that gene. Based on all this information, if that drug and gene are unknown, that's a new treatment opportunity, right? We can then go and say, like, this is a completely novel way to target lung cancer that no one else knows. So then what OneThree does is based on those predictions is tries to develop those programs. So we say, we're going to go out and actually test that target. We're going to actually test that drug. If it works, then we're going to continue testing it further and then look to partner with people. So if you think about all of the cancer drugs that are out there, what OneThree is trying to do is trying to find that next generation of cancer drugs. So what are the next treatments that we don't even know about that, 5, 10 years from now can be drugs that are treating and helping patients around the world?
Okay. And where does the AI fit into this? Because that whole delving into literature, finding out which genes are there and what treatments are already there and what the next possible treatment could be, that's something that could be done through a literature review. So does the AI help in terms of helping parse out which drugs are good candidates, or in finding what perhaps the novel targets are, or is that top secret?
It's not top secret. It's I think about it this way, right? It's yes, you can do it. You can think about maybe you can do it through literature, but the amount of papers that get published. Let's just say let's take literature for example, right? Let's say 1,000 papers get published a month, right? Which is probably an underassessment, right? In a certain type of cancer, right? So you have tens of thousands of papers a year. No scientist can possibly beat all of them. And
You
each
can't?
paper, yeah, exactly, right? And each paper has thousands of pieces of information hidden under it, right? We published a paper a few years ago, which was on a particular type of cancer.
Yeah.
We had hundreds of uh, spreadsheets attached with just different pieces of information. So what the AI does is it basically takes all of that different information that's in all of the papers out there, but also in all the other databases, right? You know, all of the data that the NCI, National Cancer Institute, is putting out, all data the NIH is putting out, all the data that the FDA is putting out, builds it all together and tries to find patterns within that data. Right. So for
Okay.
instance, it tries to say that, you know, this is a silly example, but let's say um, the AI will find that whenever imatinib is used against lung cancer cells, um, the certain genetic pathway tends to be overexpressed. Right? So this is just a simple example, right?
Sure.
But when imatinib is used against breast cancer cells, it doesn't tend to be overexpressed. What that tells us is there's some connection between this pathway, lung cancer, and imatinib, right? And you can kind of deconvolute that. So it finds those patterns. And then the more you try and understand those patterns, the more you can find completely novel things. Like maybe the reason this is happening in lung cancer is because lung cancer relies on a gene or target involved in imatinib that breast cancer doesn't. Silly example, but you can kind of get the idea of like you're finding these high level patterns, you're diving in a little bit deeper, and then you're trying to understand. So, for instance, let's just take the dopamine receptor story. What we were able to do is we took all of the data we had on different cancer subtypes and predicted based on that what are the most important genes. And what we found was we were able to find a pattern. Based on that pattern, we were able to predict that this type of glioblastoma, if it lost DRD2, that type of glioblastoma would die. Right? Whereas a lot of other cancer types, if they lost the DRD2, they might not die. What this
Hmm.
told us is, you know, we were able to find a pattern between certain genes that are lost and cancer cell death, apply that to find a new gene that, if lost, would kill glioblastoma. And since we already knew that this drug hit that gene, therefore we can say, okay, this drug hits DRD2. If DRD2 is lost, glioblastoma dies. Therefore, this drug should work on glioblastoma. So it allows us to
Hmm.
find that information and really understand
Wow.
it in a way that we previously couldn't.
That's fascinating because I've done some reading in the drug discovery space, but some of those companies have largely focused on taking a target receptor and identifying different ways that small molecules can bind to them. So that's a completely different means of deploying AI. Whereas you're like one step, I guess, behind that, not in terms of your progress, but in terms of identifying the receptor that needs to be targeted in order to target a cancer in a different way. Am I correct?
Exactly. No, you're exactly right. So I think there's a two different ways of thinking about it. There's the biology problem and there's the chemistry problem, right? So let's
Yeah.
say you already know the gene you're trying to hit. Then it's a biological question of how can you find the drug that actually is going to actually bind in there, right? You're seeing a ton of companies out there really focused on the chemistry side of the world there. Um, versus what we're doing on the biology side of things is like, what's the next drug out there? What's the next target out there, right? So for
Yeah.
instance, you know, there's a what's a target called like MEK, right? MEK is a common cancer target that people know if you hit it, you can have tree activity. People are still trying to discover better chemicals to hit it. But what we're trying, and that's the chemistry side of the world. What we're trying to solve is what is the next MEK, right? Eventually, we're going to find a chemical that hits MEK, and that's going to treat subset of cancers. But there's going to be another subset of cancers that need a different target, or you have to hit MEK and something else at the same time. So let's understand that, so that when we can give that information to chemists, they can design better drugs. So I view it as you try and understand the biology, find a target, then you try and build chemistry against that biology, you develop that chemistry, right? That's the traditional way. Sometimes people switch it where they take a bunch of chemistry, see what works, and then try and find a target off of it. But
Yeah.
traditionally, I would say it's biology, chemistry, development. We really focus on the biology piece of the world.
That's fascinating. Wow. Okay. So I'm gonna give us a little bit time to break down the drug development process, even though it's going to take a very short amount of time, and we'll probably butcher the entire thing or only talk about it at a very high level. So I apologize for those who are in the drug development world out there. But so we've already talked about, either target or drug identification as part of the initial drug discovery portion. What's the next step? Once the target and the drug are optimized or identified, what happens next before we go to clinical trials?
Yeah. So let's say this first is testing, right? So let's say like
Yeah.
let's say you have a target, you have a drug that hits that target, right? The first thing you want to prove is you want to prove that hitting that target is going to have the effect you want. Let's say for cancer, right? You want to prove that if you hit that target and lung cancer cell, most often you're looking at for like whether they die or not. So that's the first test you do. And then you want to understand that even if the lung cancer cells die, you're not going to cause side effects in the patient, right? So
Hmm.
the first thing you do is kind of you look at different experimental studies, you do animal tests, and you try and understand, is this drug hitting this target going to be efficacious, so it's going to work, and is it going to be non-toxic or safe?
Hmm.
Let's say you're able to solve all those things, right? You figure out it kills lung cancer in mice and it doesn't cause side effects in mice. Cool. Step one. The next thing
Amazing.
you want to know is like before you put it in humans, there's a bunch of tests you need to know, right? The FDA is going to want to know like how quickly is this drug metabolized by the human body, right? Like how can you make it? What's the method of delivery? Is it a pill? Is it an injection? Is it IV? You figure all of that out, right? Let's say you like, okay, you have this docket, you're like, it's a safe drug, it's efficacious. Here's all the information on that drug, and here's how we're going to give it to humans. The next step is officially the clinical trials process. So phase 1, 2, and 3. Now, this is going to be very, very broad strokes, but traditionally the goal of a phase 1 trial is to figure out, is it safe and what's the maximum dose I can give to patients before I have to worry about toxicity, right?
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I can give patients this many milligrams of the drug without causing severe effects. Cool. Phase 2 is then you want to say, does that maximum dose actually have the effect I want it to have? So in cancer, maybe it could be slow cancer cell growth, reduces tumor size, increases overall survival. Depends on the treatment you're looking at. And then phase
Mhm.
3 is kind of a combination of phase 1 and phase 2 in a much bigger patient population. Right. So phase 1 might be 10 to 50 patients, phase 2 might be 50 to 100, phase 3, you're probably looking at hundreds to thousands of patients. I mean, you monitor them over a much longer time to basically say, like, here's confirmation it's working, here's confirmation it's safe, here's where I'm looking long term. Right. So that's really like the clinical trial development process. And at the end of all of that, fingers crossed everything works, you can then have a drug that gets approved, and then you can start kind of actually prescribing it to patients outside of a clinical trial setting.
Wow. And if we flash back to several minutes before in this conversation, that takes hundreds of millions to billions of dollars in how many years?
Depends, right? So people will say anywhere from 10 to 15 years from start to finish. 10 to 15 years from
That's
preclinical
wild.
to approval. Yeah. Um, if you include all the things like testing it in cells and testing it in animals, you're probably easily looking at that, 10 years. I think the goal now with companies like ours is to reduce that, right? So we can have something that goes, there's been a lot of talk about going from target to compound within a year, which would be a massive improvement. And then you'll probably hopefully you can bring it under the 10-year mark.
Mhm. So how long does that target compound normally take now?
I would say anywhere from 5 to 8 years, right? Like normally it's
Wow.
a crazy long process because like not only, and it also depends on where it's done, right? I think in
Yeah.
pharma, depending on if it's a well-known target, it can be a little bit shorter. If it's a completely novel target, it's different, much longer, but also you have to think about just things fail along the way. So it's by no means a short and easy process.
So, I mean, failure must be a huge cost in this process overall in terms of years invested as well as money invested overall. And that fivefold to eightfold reduction in terms of, I guess, target to actual drug is a massive improvement that not only can end up, number one, saving more patient lives as the drug gets on shelves faster, but also saves patent years for companies, which is really, really important if they want to maintain their IP. Am I correct?
Yeah, so maybe say it a little more time. Yeah, so it's like, can you repeat the question one more time? You broke up a little in the middle there.
Oh, no, no worries. So the main benefits for that reduction in time from drug identification and refinement, so targeted drug identification, the main benefits would be getting them on shelves faster, which then downstream would result in the drug being available to patients, more patient lives being saved, and as a result, or also on the other side, the drugs being on patent longer for the companies, which means that they're able to bring in revenue while they're on patent so that they're able to reinvest some of those profits in R&D as well. Am I correct?
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. Yeah, so like, drugs traditionally have a 20-year patent life, right? If
Yeah.
simple terms, if you spend 15 years developing the drug, companies have 5 years to kind of make all their money back, which leads to a
Yeah.
bunch of different things, like higher drug prices, a bunch of things that are difficult for them, right? Now, let's say you can bring that 15 years down to 10. They now have 10 years of patent life, which means they can sell the drug for longer. They means they can, it becomes more valuable for companies. It can help patients quicker, right? So that's 5 years extra where the patients are actually getting a drug that can be helpful. It allows companies to reinvest those on kind of promising areas, right? So for instance, rather than 15 years on, drugs can always be improved. So rather than spending 15 years versus spending on version one, you can spend 10 years working on version one and getting right started on version two right after, or some new
Yeah.
discoveries. So it just generally improves the pace of scientific innovation and patient care. So I think there's benefits across the world. And then, of course, just the simple monetary benefit of every year the drug is spent in development, you are paying scientists, experimental studies, right? Like, not only
Yeah.
are you spending costs and resources waiting, but it's also like, that's an expensive process, right? A clinical trial can cost $100 million. If a clinical trial goes on longer, that's even more money you're spending. So any way you can shorten this process down, either in the preclinical or the clinical stage, can just not only help the companies, but have huge effects on the patients and communities as well.
Hmm. So, I mean, the fascinating thing about your website right now is that you've got so many partners who are in perhaps the drug discovery, perhaps development world. Why wouldn't you discover the, I guess, perhaps targets yourself and try to bring those compounds to life yourself, apart from it being exorbitantly expensive?
Yeah, so short answer is we're actually doing that now, right? Like we're doing a bit of both. We're working with partners, but we also have our own in-house programs that we fully own and developing. Um,
Hmm.
I think it's really interesting because of course we have some things we're really excited about that we're developing, but we also know that we can't possibly develop everything. So that's why we're working with partners. So I think you're exactly there's the answer as why we're not is there's no reason why we're not, we are doing it. It's just thinking about where we can spend resources, specifically as a small company, right? Like we can't possibly develop 20 different drug discovery programs. Maybe we can have one or two, and as we grow, maybe that can change. But we're saying these are the two that we're really focusing our internal efforts on, but we also want to work in these areas through partnership.
Hmm. Hmm. So, I mean, we've talked a lot about the whole drug discovery process, forming partnerships, being able to define which drug candidates you're going to try to bring to life on your own versus in partnerships. What part of these tasks lies under your role as CEO? And how well prepared did you feel to be the CEO and co-founder of a company such as this by being in the PhD space?
Yeah, the short answer is I don't think no startup founder will ever feel fully prepared. And I think that's kind of it's just the world we have to live, right? Because like you're going after something new, right? Like most startups are inherently going after new problems, something new in that area. So there's no playbook you're going after, right? You can try and understand as much as you can, right? You can say, like, I understand the science, or if it's a tech startup, I understand the software, the business, whatever, and kind of prepare yourself. But any startup founder who's like, I feel fully prepared for everything is probably lying to you. Now, I think the science aspect gave me a really interesting area, right? Like anyone coming from a science background, like what a PhD really teaches you at the end of the day is how to, creatively think about and analyze problems. So what we're able to do is I felt very prepared to kind of come in and say, hey, you know what? Like, this is a problem I'm really interested in. I'm really going to solve this. And I feel like I'm confident about how to understand this and develop it a little bit further.
Mhm.
So that's something I always felt very prepared to do and something I'm, never was worried about. Now,
Mm.
um, what another area could be is that's like, I feel like I understand the science well, right? Like I comfortable talking to a scientific team, to a scientific audience. And that's an area where the PhD has been very helpful.
Yeah.
But also I think some PhDs and what a PhD has been useful for is like, specifically in a PhD like mine, like I got a chance to work with so many interdisciplinary people. I got a chance to work with oncologists, data scientists, biochemists. And that's really what a startup founder's job is you're trying to communicate across many different teams, right? The business team, the engineering team, the science team, the finance team. So like that sort of collaborative aspect is something I'm very thankful that I got a chance to experience during my PhD. But like I said, I think there's no one path to becoming a startup founder, right? There's a lot of founders who have PhD experience, specifically in biotech, a lot who come out of kind of traditional, more business development or finance experience, some who come straight out of software engineering and programming. I think you just have to acknowledge where your strengths are and trying to build a team around you to fill in the gaps that you have in your own stuff.
So I guess, would you advise someone, or if you could go back, would you tell yourself to go back and gain expertise in more fields so you're able to communicate more effectively across different disciplines? Or would you keep the same cards that you have in terms of working with data as well as cancer so that you're able to most effectively address those two key areas before bringing on team to address the different other areas which you may not have as much expertise in?
I think it really just depends on the type of founder or the type of role you want, right? I can imagine for some people it makes a ton of sense to take this, for lack of a better word, uh, like more generalist approach where they're like, okay, I'm going to kind of work across multiple different areas. I'm going to try and learn a little bit about everything. I think that's very helpful. Some founders kind of like to be very specialized. They're saying like, I'm going to work in this very specialized field. I'm going to kind of really understand the ins and outs of this very, very well. And I'm going to be the best at this one thing. So I think it really just depends. I think as a PhD, you're always going to be a little bit specialized. And I think that's just kind of the nature of the game. And that's completely fine. I think I have no regrets about that. So I don't know if I would say if I went back, if I would try and do a little bit more of everything. I think I always would recommend that just to experience a little bit more of the world. And everyone who's getting a PhD or any career, I was like, learn and experience as much as you can. But if you're asking whether I would focus less on the science to focus more on anything, I think the answer is no. I would just try and learn a little bit more alongside it. But I think for me, I was always very interested in like a very specialized problem and a very specialized role. So it worked well.
hmm And, this last question here is perhaps one that, I don't know much about. So correct me if I'm wrong, but on your website, again, you've worked with both institutional in terms of educational institutions as well as corporate partners. What's the difference between the two? And would you advise perhaps you yourself to go back and, stack up on working with one versus the other at an early stage of OneThree?
Yeah, I think the short answer, I think you have to do both.
Okay.
I think like academic partners, you have a lot more freedom is maybe a simple way to think about it. Like they have different incentive structure. They just have different things they're trying to work toward. Right? Like
hmm
an academic partner is going to allow you to, answer problems. There's not as much focus on budgets necessarily. There is, but like there's a little less focus on the business side of things. And I think that's really cool. Whereas I think business partners have um, a little bit more follow through, for instance, especially if you're working on clinical projects, right? If you want to work on a phase 3 clinical trial, a pharma company who's running hundreds of those is going to have much more reach than a single professor in a single academic lab who might be working on one. In the
Yeah.
ideal partnership, you'd love to have a little bit of both. You'd have to work at a pharma company and at an academic institution or research institution, kind of a three-way partnership. But I think for anyone starting off, it's probably important to have a bit of both. I would just say if you're really looking at the startup space, you probably need to, at a certain point, venture more industry, right? Because they're going to be the people who, at the end of the day, are going to be working with you, using your services, funding you. So the sooner you can understand that side of the world, the better.
hmm All right. And I think we're running close on time. So before we go, do you have any pluggables that you'd like to plug, Neil?
Yeah, no, of course, right? Thank you guys for having me. Right? Like, for anyone more interested more in what we're doing at OneThree, our website is www.one3.bio. We're on Twitter at OneThree Biotech, and my personal Twitter is at Neel Madhukar, NeelMadhukar. Feel free to check us out. Shoot me an email if there's anything I can do to help, or if you have any questions. We are always hiring, so anyone looking for positions, full-time internship consultant, please hit me up, and I'm looking forward to chatting with them.
Awesome. And you can find us, How It's Med, at How It's Med on Twitter, as well as at howitsmed.com on the interwebs. And looking forward to chatting with y'all soon.